It's great to welcome Professor Jonathan Tran. He goes by Cat. He is the George W. Baines Chair of Religion at Baylor University, and today we're discussing his book, Asian Americans and the Spirit of Racial Capitalism. Cat, welcome to the show. How are you?
Oh, just to let you know, Chong, I'm actually at Duke University, so I
Oh,
moved, yeah,
okay.
since that
That's it.
since the biography. So yeah,
That's it. Okay.
yeah,
Can you restate your job title at Duke University?
sure. I'm a professor of theological ethics at Duke University.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I was looking at someone sent me a Wikipedia page the other day, and I was like, oh yeah, it's a couple years old, so
okay. So I'll revise the introduction then. Jonathan
sure.
Tran, or Cat, is the professor of theological ethics at Duke University, and we're discussing Asian Americans and the spirit of racial capitalism. Cat, Jonathan, welcome to the show. How are you?
Thank you for having me on. It's a great honor. I'm doing well. It's great to be talking with you.
Yes, and it's good to be talking to a fellow Vietnamese as well. You came highly recommended from your colleague and mentor at Duke, Professor Stanley Harvas. So,
Yes, Dr. Hauerwas has been my teacher for 30 years now, and it's a great privilege and honor to be with him in North Carolina now. We're writing a book together on Christianity and the promise of politics. He has advanced a very important political theory around the Christian church, and so we're offering a kind of systematic political theory of that account.
let's see. So, when do you hope the book will come out?
Probably my guess 2027, so in about 2 years.
Okay.
So
Right.
yeah.
I'll be sure to revisit that on the show if you,
Oh, that'd be
and
wonderful.
yeah, if both of you and Professor Halbus would like to come. Yeah,
Great.
yeah, he was on this podcast last month. We discussed one of his intellectual influences, Alistair McIntyre.
Oh, right. At the passing of McIntyre, passing of a giant.
Yes, yeah, he really influenced my political thinking.
Oh yeah, me too. We read Professor Hauerwas had us read McIntyre from my earliest days in graduate school, and so McIntyre has been hugely influential as well as for me, and as many people, of course.
Certainly. Tell me about your journey as a Christian.
Sure. Well, I came to America at the end of the American War in Vietnam in 1975. So my family was those who were evacuated out of in my case, out of Saigon in 1975 in April as the war came to a pretty abrupt end. It was for America at the time the longest war in American history, uh, unofficially and officially lasting nearly a quarter of a century. So the war ended quickly, and my family had ties to the U.S. government, and so we were part of that group that was, taken to America. I was only two, so incidentally, I'm returning to Vietnam at the end of this year, at the end of which is 50 years since I left Vietnam. So
Oh well.
we're excited for this return. My wife and I and my kids will meet in Vietnam, so I'm very excited about this. Vietnam, as you know much better than I, has changed tremendously during that time. So I won't remember anything of the old, but I'm really looking forward to experiencing Vietnam. We came to America without much religion. We, like many Vietnamese in those days, were patriated to America through a partnership between the U.S. government and American churches, mainly in the mainline denominations, Protestantism and Catholicism. Our family was taken in by Lutherans, who were very, very generous and kind to us. I don't think any of us really became Christian from that. Years later, really as I began college at university is where I kind of began to uh, be a follower of Jesus. And, in some sense, I've been trying to make sense of it since then. So I've been a Christian over 30 years now.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Um, yeah, I've only been received in the Catholic Church 3 years ago. So I'm
Okay.
still a novice in this regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think were you religious before that in some
No, no. My parents were culturally Buddhist, but they didn't pass on their religiosity to me.
okay. Well, then one of the things you will know that a lot of our um, fellow Christians who are raised in the faith often don't know is that for people like us, the default position cognitively is not belief. So, whereas for people who grow up in the church, their default position in the universe is that there is a God and the world makes sense in terms of God.
Mhm.
For me, it's you're kind of constantly trying to constellate your concepts in ways that God is part of it. And even after, 3 decades, I still default to the other position. So it's amazing how much our brain is wired by a certain age, and therefore to try to rewire it with concepts of God and belief, it is in you get a sense of the enormity of conversion. Um,
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a daily experience for me, right? Every day I learn there's a new thing that that you should believe as a Christian, and of course I need to know why and everything.
yeah, yeah, daily thing in terms of the why of how the concepts hang together, a daily thing in terms of the practices. I remember one of the earlier things for me was learning not to fight as a way to navigate
Mhm.
difficulties.
Oh yeah.
You can imagine growing up poor in a fairly racist country. I just fought a lot. Like my brother taught me to fight, and so I was just involved in a lot of fist fights. And so when you
Oh,
become a Christian, of course, fist fighting is uncomely. It doesn't quite cohere with the concept. So that was one of the early experiences I remember, like, the that can't be my natural reaction to difficult things. So
right. So, what surprises you about race and racism in the United States?
that's a great question. Um, I wish more people would ask themselves that question. What is surprising about race? I think in America for a good bit now, race seems like a rather natural phenomenon. People think about and talk about race as if it's the most natural thing around. They talk about being racial people, say white or Asian or black or what have you, as naturally as they might say, uh, talk about being American or Vietnamese or residents of the state of Texas or North Carolina. Um, Whereas race is a bit more tricky of a concept. It requires a fair amount more baggage to kind of make sense. And like all concepts, you're always kind of maintaining them with other ways of thinking and acting and behaving. But race is a particularly porous concept. It has think about other concepts. They have pretty powerful explanatory power. Like if I were to say, why do I have a North Carolina driver's license? It's because I live in the state of North Carolina. I'm subservient to its laws on the road. Uh, you know, why do I drive into school every day? Because that's the main form of my income. So I have responsibilities. If I decide not to drive to school and teach classes, then there would be repercussions. It's less clear how race works. It's not a set of laws. It's not a geographical area, right? Like North Carolina is. We might say like Asian Americans or Asians are a race geographically imagined, but Asia as a continent, as a geographical area, is an incredibly diverse reality. As they say, in Africa, there's more genetic diversity than there is everywhere elsewhere in the world combined. So to talk about Black people as a race is a pretty tricky thing. And it explains very little. If I say to you, I did something or I experienced something because I'm Asian, that doesn't mean that insofar as you're Asian, you'll experience it the same, but that's the suggestion. So race is a pretty weak concept, and yet it has incredible power in in American society. And so my inquiry into it was to really ask why that is the case. And of course, that follows from a kind of experience of being racially defined and racially categorized and racially experiencing the world as an effect, over decades. As soon as I came to America, I was, defined racially. I was Asian, and the definitions were not good ones because, you know, um, when I came to America, America had finished three wars over three subsequent decades with Asian countries, Japan, Korea, and the Vietnamese. Each were deadly wars for Americans. Many Americans died and suffered from in those wars. And so racially, I was seen as a dangerous person. And so you can imagine what it was like to arrive in America in the 1970s and 80s for Vietnamese people in the subsequent waves of kind of immigration. It was not easy. And then, the other interesting part of it is that it's not simply that it was hard to receive us on the part of white people. It was hard for Black people to receive us. It was hard for the Koreans to receive the Vietnamese, just like it was hard for the Japanese to receive the Koreans. Each generation re-racializes its own people in a sense to kind of make sense of the world and organize things in political economic ways. So my thinking about race is both conceptual and theoretical, but it's of course deeply personal.
So, so how should a committed Christian, regardless of race, think about the notion of race?
And this is what I try to tease out in the book, at least in American theology over the last decades. Race has largely been taken for granted, that we are racial creatures. And then it's been the attempt to think through whether that's good that we do that. Oftentimes people point to the problems, but they often revert to a kind of racial talk, that there is a quality of you as a person that can be defined and related to racially. So it's a kind of interesting right hand and left hand maneuver. The right hand critiques race and racial categories as Christians, and the left hand still lives them out. And so I wanted to think through why that's the case. My next book with my co-author, Vincent Lloyd, called simply Race and Christianity, we try to think through why that's the case. Um, in the book Asian Americans in the Spirit of Racial Capitalism, what I show is that race has a very particular heritage. It's not, the legacy of race isn't really about difference, right? The difference between me as an Asian person and someone as a white person, for example. It's not really about diversity. American universities, really up till the last couple of years, was in a decades long spell that diversity was the correct institutional way to celebrate and honor racial difference. And so there would be classes on diversity and training in diversity and equity and inclusion. Um, but race really isn't about difference, or it's not really about diversity. Race is about differentiation. It's about making categorical distinctions so that we can create a society that rightly organizes itself around racial difference and racial inequality. Um, and it's not really about diversity. It's about stratification. Race categories were largely created, as you know, in Europe and America for the sake of political economic application. And so, if you were a certain kind of people, then certain things could be given to you or taken away from you. And it wasn't the idea. The idea wasn't because you're this race, we can give you these things or take them away. It was more like we're already going to give you these things or take them away from you. The way we justify that is race. And so we had a political economic reality, race as a way of explaining things, which was a retrospective kind of explanation. It was a justification for the way things were going to be anyways. Um, and so the example I often use is if you go around any typical American city, there's pretty clearly racial differences in the geography and also who has access to financial systems or healthcare or good education. And the way we make sense of it in our minds is we see some racial differences and we explain them accordingly. So we say, oh, I see why these brown people over here don't have school. It's because they're brown. It's and it, which is kind of gaslights them. It blames them for their situation. Oh, I see why this neighborhood has really right good jobs. Oh, because they're white. That's what white people deserve, right? White people are smarter. They're more capable of good jobs. So it's a backward mentality trying to explain. Because really what we don't want to do as society, right? What we want to do is blame people. What we don't want to do is ask ourselves as a society, why have we organized society such that there are such extraordinarily breathtaking forms of inequality, dehumanizing processes and commitments? We don't want to ask that question. That question is too scary. It hits too close to home, especially if you are, like I am, a person of privilege, a person who that society benefits, awards, champions, even cherishes, right? And so rather than asking, why do I get to live this way? It's much easier to blame other people. It's much easier to kind of participate in these gaslighting maneuvers that is race thinking. So, how should a Christian think about these things? These are, in Christian terms, in the old familiar Christian terms, these are forms of idolatry. And idolatry are often systems of justification and injustice. And so Christians should think very hard about whether these concepts should play organizing roles in their lives, whether it means who they're friends with, who they go to church with, how they think about, things like mission, how they think about things like ministry. So there is a complicated question of whether Christians should think at all in terms of race. On the one hand, we can't not think in terms of race because we live in a society that thinks in terms of race. On the other hand, to think only in terms of race seems to me to be a kind of violence to the Christian gospel, which is a gospel of reconciliation, of justice, of liberation. So uh, I think the question then, long answer to your good question is something like Christian discipleship should give us some ways of resisting race thinking while also trying to fight for liberation and justice within worlds that think very much in terms of race.
That's wonderful. Yeah. So your book makes the case that in many ways, American capitalism and the American Christian church have both, in some ways, been shaped just in part by um, the categorization and definition of races that I think exists at the beginning, even before of American history. So tell me more about this notion first of racial capitalism.
Yeah, racial capitalism is the idea that, so sometimes, at least in the United States, we tend to have a certain account of history where, in relationship specifically to political economic models and slavery, we tend to think about this. We say, before we're a civilized economic society, that is, before we became capitalists, we participated in feudal forms of political economy, namely things like slavery or feudal land ownership. And so we had feudal lords and people had to live on their land. And then we had slavery, and that was just all in the kind of olden days. And then we got mature and enlightened as a society. And then we believed we developed capitalism and started giving people wages and started thinking, right, we shouldn't enslave people, rather we should pay them for their labor. That's how we've tended to think about it. And of course, that history, that sequence, is a self-justifying sequence because it suggests that insofar as we're capitalized, we're more enlightened than, say, we're the slave owners. But The documentary history suggests something very different, that in actuality, slavery, especially American chattel slavery, and then the entire global slave trade that had to do with both slaves, but also mercantile development in Northern Europe, had to do with, a kind of triangulated relationship between the southern colonies and the development of cotton primarily, but other commodities and goods, the banking systems of North America, namely New York, and then the kind of growing industrial centers of places like Manchester, England, that this conglomerated into the most powerful commodity, cotton, and propelled the US economy to become the most powerful. In that case, slavery and capitalism are not separately occurring realities, much less slavery happened, ended in capitalism. Rather, capitalism and slavery grew up together. They are co-occurring phenomenon. It's hard to think of one without the other. I'll give you an example that Edward Baptist, the historian of slavery, offers in his work. He says that many of us in America, of course, know about mortgages. That's how we buy houses. We take out a loan from the bank, they give us money, we buy the house, we don't pay the owner, we pay back the bank. Um, Sometimes we even take out second mortgages. That means we've owned our house for some time. We can borrow against how much we've earned on the house. All that technological, that economic technology, these technologies of capital were developed during slavery. How did people often afford to buy enslaved persons? These were not inexpensive. They took out mortgages. Um, and the banks gave them the money with the promise that, right, the slave would make the owner enough money that then the owner can pay back the bank. Just like when I buy a house and it appreciates, I can pay back the bank with the money earned. The bank makes money because my house appreciates. The bank made money because the slave's work paid, right, dividends for the owner. Just like in the case of mortgages, of course, banks have to have their loans secured, because if people don't pay back, then the money the bank owes other people is not going to be secured. So who secured the bank loans? The state and federal government. That's, of course, exactly what we do now. Federal and state governments secure loans so that banks can make these loans. What Baptist does in a pretty powerful argument is that he shows that in 1837, the Great Panic of 1837 maps parallelly onto the Great Recession in America in 2008. In both cases, right, you had massive amounts of loans. In the first case, the slaves, and the second in relationship to home mortgages that needed to be securitized by the state and federal government, that then became such a bubble that if that bubble were to burst, then the whole thing would fall apart. And that's what happened in 1837. And then that's also what happened in 2008. So it shows the direct relationship between capitalism and slavery, right? And Baptist also shows that we're still doing the same thing. We still largely operate with the same business model, right? As the great historian David Harvey has shown, America basically made a decision that its entire financial industry would be backed by the housing industry, and housing as the primary backbone of the banking industry. And where the banking industry went, say with houses and loans, was where the entire economy would go. Well, what Baptist shows is that type of thinking grew up in terms of our early capitalist forms of capitalist industries in the 19th century through enslavement. So the argument about racial capitalism is that capitalism and these awful things we do around race are deeply integrated realities. What I try to argue is you cannot think about race outside of thinking about political economies. You can't think about racism. You can't be anti-racist. You can't fight racism without thinking about political economies. Um, it's not going to be as easy as diversity trainings or getting myself to think better or having relationships where there's not microaggressions. This is some of the language. It's going to be more, we're going to have to ask ourselves why our society makes race thinking so natural. Well, the reason race thinking is so natural is because racism in our society, the reason it persists and endures, racism exists because racism works. It persists because we need it to persist. It helps us explain what I described earlier as these neighborhood inequalities, who gets access to banking systems and education. Race justifies and explains all that in a way that makes sense. So if we want to break apart racism, we're going to need to break apart the society. But as long as we have a society of inequality, we will have justifications that have to do with race. That's what racial capitalism names.
I see. So my second question concerns how race in some ways influence the American Christian church. Of course, the most obvious example when you look at history is how can these, uh, those who believe in the Bible as the Word of God and goes to church every Sunday can justify, treating another human being of a different race as less than. Of course, both in terms of slavery and in terms of, segregation. So, what answers have you reached in regards to this question so far?
Yeah, there have been very powerful attempts to show that racism issues out of, say, Christian forms of heresy. So, my teachers, J. Cameron Carter, in his book Race, a Theological Analysis, and then Willie Jennings, in his book The Christian Imagination, shows how race thinking comes out of heretical Christian thinking. That is, Christians thinking badly, specifically about Christ, about Christology, and in ways that kind of made what we didn't like about Christ's humanness, we we imputed that, say, onto Black people. And these are very powerful accounts of how theology directly leads to forms of very, very violent racial behavior. I think there's a probably a different, I offer a different kind of explanation, one I think is more clear cut. That is, we are sinful, greedy, and our sin is specifically the sin of greed. My good friend Malcolm Foley just wrote a book called The Anti-Greed Gospel, where he also articulates this, that race really comes out of a covetousness for more, the desire to have more, the desire to secure our lives. It's more directly the sin that is portrayed in the Old and New Testament, of the idea that God isn't enough for us, that what God promises in terms of sustaining us, we just don't trust. And so we need more, we need to accumulate more. And then the idolatry of America is of an empire that will promise and gain us more, both more for ourselves, but more for us as a society, that then will militarize our borders and make sure no one ever takes our stuff because it's our stuff. It's very much the sin of Adam and Eve, where God says, you have all of this, the entirety of creation, every tree, and they just can't believe they don't have one tree because they need it all. It's the sin of David in relationship to his violence against Bathsheba and her husband, where Nathan confronts David later on and says, God had given you everything. And if you wanted anything more, you would have needed to only ask. And so even there, it's presented as a sin of covetousness, of greed. And then in the New Testament, another paradigmatic example of sin is the of the two brothers, one demanding the inheritance and leaving, the other one unwilling to share his inheritance with his younger brother who had come back. And what does the father say to the older brother, but in a sense to both brothers? All that I have is yours. You only need to ask. That's God, right? Through Luke, through Nathan, through Genesis, saying creation as a very function of creation is sheer gift, it's sheer grace, it's sheer gratuity. It is the excess of the love between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Everything you could possibly ever need, you already have. And you know this simply as a function of existing at all. And God continues to express this most powerfully when, as the scripture says, God gives his own son, as if anything you could possibly need. And it's the continued struggle of Christian faith to believe that God is sufficient for us. And in our unbelief, then we want other things. And in wanting other things, we will do anything to get them, including the most vile things. So I think what racism is of the kind you're talking about, treating people horribly in the name of race, is a function of this. We're sinful people, but we're not so sinful that we don't think we need reasons to explain our sin. And so we justify our sin, usually in terms of racial categories. I treat that person because that way, because they're this or they're that. Or I'm not friends with them because I couldn't possibly be friends with this kind of person or that kind of person. Um, the great additional tragedy of that, of course, is that God can handle our sins. That's what cross and resurrection name. But what God can't handle is our own justifications of our sins, where we say to God, not only have I sinned, but I don't need you to help me. And so this is where sin becomes toxic to all of creation. Everything goes with this, right? It's only because of the great grace of God that it doesn't destroy everything. But yeah, so I use the kind of old standard categories of Christian discipleship and holiness to explain the kinds of sins of racial sin.
Certainly. Okay. Now, I like to explore the ways in which Asian Americans, to the extent that it can be defined, because it encompasses so many ethnicities and cultures. How does this population fit into, well, first, the discussion on race in America, and then followed by, American capitalism and American Christian church? So first, so how does the Asian American population fit into the discussion of race in the United States?
Yeah, and it's a good question because it's a particular contextual question. Of course, race works differently in different places in the world. In Asia, oftentimes race is thought about in relationship to the different kinds of Asians, say South Asians, in relationship to East Asians, in relationship to Southeast Asians. And at least as I've experienced, it's a kind of pecking order, right? Vietnamese are seen as lower oftentimes than Chinese or Japanese, Koreans, and sometimes it's understood in terms of color, right? Whoever's darker, there's a kind of problem. And some of this predated American colonization and European colonization, where categories of whiteness came. Right, the first people who were thought of as yellow um, right, were the South Asians in relationship to people who thought of themselves as white, East Asians. So it's an interesting kind of complicated history. In America, race is mostly thought of as a white and black question, and for many good reasons, because of the history of chattel slavery and the long aftermath of chattel slavery. We've thought about race relations as we often talk about it, or racial reconciliation or racial justice, as about the justice or reconciliation of white and black people after all the damage of kind of white anti-black racism. Um, the benefit of that is that we need to do that work. That's a long history and it will continue rightfully so for a long time into the future. I think there's a great question about whether a society can survive something like chattel slavery, that or whether a society built on chattel slavery like America was can ever go on that long. Just like, a society built on the dispossession of native lands, as also is the case for the United States, whether that it can go on or it's just a matter of a kind of um, a kind of ticking clock. The current state of politics in America might suggest that we're already at the end. And compared to European countries, we're a pretty young country, but we're a country built on slavery, and so I think we would like to pretend we can just go on, being a country built on slavery, but very possibly for probably good moral reasons, we can't. Um, so, um, so there's really good reason it should be thought about in terms of black and white. But the problem, of course, is if you're not black or white. Or I would say that for black or white people, that's a problem too, because then they're not helped by thinking about race more broadly. So, as you know, in Europe, race is thought about pretty differently. It has to do with black and white, but it also has to do with questions of migration. It has to do with questions, very obviously, it's connected to questions of class and economy and immigration histories. Um, you're in Eastern, what's often called Eastern Europe, and some of the racial tensions in Western Europe have to do with the East more than the South. Nowadays, it has to do with the South because the immigration from, say, Africa, but previously it had to do with immigration from Eastern Europe into Western Europe. So, and then, in the case of America, when those folks came to America, they're all considered white, but many Western Europeans wouldn't consider Eastern or Southern Europeans white, right? So the English didn't even consider the Irish white. So, but I think part of learning all this kind of more granular history is that it reminds us that the category of race is a pretty absurd category that is supposed to hold all this together. What the Asians do for America on questions of race is it complicates the story in exactly this way. In the same way, if Americans learned about race history in Europe, they would have to think about race history in America differently. Well, Asians are a living case in America that race has to be thought about differently. Um, Latino people, right? Folks coming up from Central and South America, living in America forces us to think about things differently. Immigration as a live story forces us to think about things differently. The question is whether the power of the black white story is so powerful that it will continuously pass over those different ways of thinking, or whether those different ways of thinking will force onto the American imagination a more expansive and a more complicated story. And my thinking is the more complicated, the better on this, because the more we realize race is too thin, too small, too brittle a concept to hold all this together, the sooner we'll think and ask ourselves as a society, should we continue to think and organize racially? Or should we think in other terms? And so Asian Americans are this, right? Asian Americans don't fit the story in any clear way. Asian Americans are clearly victims of racism, from everything from the violence against Asian Americans in America during COVID to the Japanese internment, the systematic rounding up of Japanese folks, to the anti-Chinese movements, to the anti-South Asian movements during migration. All these histories complicate greatly the story. But it's also the case that Asian Americans are oftentimes perpetrators of racism, right? They're very much participants in the racial political economy called racial capitalism. They very much benefit from it. Think about how American educational systems work. Asians, right, are the most educated class of Americans, now the wealthiest class of Americans, and it's very easy to show how that ascension happened over and against Black and Brown people, by way of access to education, of where you're going to live, questions like this. So all these kinds of questions are important histories that kind of challenge the dominant way we think about race. So Asian Americans are interesting. So when I wrote the book, what I thought was the benefit to thinking through Asian Americans, not simply the benefit of me thinking about my own experience, but the benefit of thinking about Asian Americans is it helps us to illumine the broader story of race in America.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, you alluded to, how Asian Americans broadly participated and succeeded in, the racial capitalist hierarchy, so to speak. And that brings me to, this sociological term that I think both of us would find problematic, the myth of the model minority. Um, so how does the reality of, say, Asian American life reflect upon this myth?
So the myth of the model minority refers to a very specific experience in American history, but also a more general phenomenon. Specifically, it referred to a specific newspaper article that described the Japanese as the model minority. And this is written in the 1960s. The idea seemed to be, right, the 1960s being that time where um, there was a fight for racial justice, specifically on behalf of Black people against white racism that had gone on for centuries. Um, and the article written by a sociologist describes the model minority. It seemed to be saying rather than rebel and complain about being poor, right, you should be like the Japanese. They're the proper model of how to be racial in America. So if you stop complaining and work like them, then you can, oh, after 5 generations, own your own property. And, if you projected Peterson's idea some decades down the line, you could also be the wealthiest class of ethnic groups in America, the most educated, right? And the reason Vietnamese people or Taiwanese Americans end up at Harvard and Princeton is because they don't complain. They just work hard. No one doubts they suffer racism, but they don't spend their time thinking about it. So it was a way of saying this is the model. Clearly, as part of that model, there was a disciplinary tactic. That is, it sought to discipline the other races and say, stop complaining. It's a gaslighting move, like I described earlier, to say, if you're complaining, that's on you, that's your fault. And so, not only that, so the disciplinary thing pits Asians against everybody else because it makes it look like Asians came up with this idea themselves to, in a sense, stratify the political economy and say, hey, you all should be like this. And while I have no doubt that some Asians thought in those terms and maybe even spoke in those terms, it was a model portrayed by white America to organize a society of inequality that we had. Um, the model is predicated, at least it thinks, on things like the fact that Asian Americans tend to do really well in school, that we have really high SAT averages and standardized test scores and excel at university at a much higher rate than everyone else. And um, and the problem with the model minority myth, as you say, is multiple. On the one hand, it's inaccurate, right? Not all Asians do well in school. Taiwanese do really well because they mostly came to America, oftentimes from histories of migration from some of the most elite universities in Taiwan to some of the most elite universities in America. So they would go from Taipei to to MIT or to Georgia Tech because it wasn't everyone that was coming from Taiwan. It was already an elite class of people. They were elite there and they became elite here. Or if you're South, if you're a part of the South Asian diaspora from India, you came to America to study, say, in big pharma, and you ended up where I live in North Carolina, the highest per capita PhD research triangle in the world, which is around me tons of South Asians. But that's not because all South Asians come to America. It's because a very select group get to come to America. But it looks like all Asians are this smart or this able. But if you look at the history of certain Southeast Asian groups, right, say Cambodians have the lowest rates of not college graduation, one of the lowest rates of high school graduation. Koreans, often held up as the paragon of academic and financial success, have some of the lowest rates of medical insurance of any group of people in America. So it's the whole thing is predicated supposedly on facts, but of course it's very, very selective facts, as race is often doing. And then it has this pitting effect and this disciplinary effect between Asians and non-Asian minority people. I always say, though, that the most dangerous thing about the model minority myth isn't that it's factually inaccurate or that it pits people of color against each other or that it disciplines other race. Those are all deadly, harmful things. But maybe the most powerful and deadly thing about the model minority myth is that it invites Asian Americans into it. It says to them, it's not so much saying to Black people how to be, it's saying to Asian people how to be. This is who you are. This is your script. This is your story. You are the American dream. And so, no matter what else you do, get your SAT score, get into Harvard and Princeton, participate in systems that you will never question. And the rewards for you will be a lifetime of wealth and success and comfort. If you're a Christian and you're trying to follow Jesus, that is a deadly temptation. I work with very gifted students in Baylor's Honors College and Duke University. The Asians here, the Asians at Duke University tell me that the pressure to get into Duke does not compare to the pressure of being at Duke, which is you've worked your entire life to get here. It's incredibly difficult to get here, and now you need to make good. The pressures from your family, from society, the pressures of being with other very talented students. And so no wonder you're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about, questions about justice or about society, much less thinking about Jesus. You're going to think about how you can, get the right internship or do well in biomedical as a biomedical engineer. And that road is paved towards success and comfort. The very greed and covetousness that we talked about earlier. And so getting them to believe that the gospel actually calls us to something better for the world in terms of justice and liberation, but as importantly, better for them. That if they get Jesus, what they get is Jesus, which is better than anything the world has to offer. Getting them to come to terms with those very kind of basic claims of Christian discipleship against the promise of the model minority myth is, as you can imagine, quite the challenge. But when we see it happens, it is quite the thing to behold because what you see is the Holy Spirit working in the lives of these students or families or communities and charging them with a much greater, more exciting future and life to be a part of.
Certainly. I believe I read from the late great Pastor Tim Keller that one of the sins that American churches rarely talk about, uh, as opposed to the more frequently discussed like sins like lust or even envy, is greed. Um, I think whenever a pastor, he illustrates that whenever a pastor mentions lust or envy, the congregation, you know, explodes in applause. But when he mentions greed, the congregation falls in silence.
Yeah. Well, it's similar to that adage that I think I can't remember who it was, but maybe it's said by many people. Um, but when you call out racism, people applaud you. When you call out uh, greed, people call you a communist. And there's very, very important difference between communism and Marxism and the Gospels. But what they seem to share is that they are greatly both worried about greed and what greed does to the human soul and the possibility of goodness. I mean, greed is just such a kind of intimate experience. That's why we can have all these explanations for why we're racist, including theological ones. But personally, I think most of this can explain why greed is so powerful. We're greedy people. We tend to not think enough is enough. I mean, you see this every time if you go to a buffet, an all you can eat buffet, which is a total thing in America, and then you've eaten your fill, you're not just full, you're uncomfortably full. And then the restaurant says, last call on the buffet, it's going to close. And there's just an absolute beeline to the buffet because this idea that we just can't have enough. I mean, the greatest effect, of course, of our greed is what is happening to the planet. In the same way that America probably won't survive chattel slavery, the world will not survive human greed. Um, at this point, we're either going to need to be saved by AI or the Holy Spirit, um, because what we've done to the planet in our greed has far exceeded what the planet was made for.
Yes. So lastly, I'd like to focus on the participation of Asian Americans in the American church. So, from your observations, how enthusiastic are they in their participation?
My wife grew up in a Chinese Baptist church, and it was one of these churches that a lot of Asian Americans will grow up in first generation churches, where the point of the church is twofold, and because twofold, really wonderful. So it's not the case of what I experienced when I came to America and I participated in a Lutheran congregation of mostly white people. it's first generation immigrants coming to America and establishing their own church. Now, often they're helped to do so by these mainline Protestant or Catholic churches. But they eventually have their own church. And the church does two things for every generation of immigrants who comes and joins that church. It introduces them and helps them live in America, and it introduces them and helps them live as Christians. And that's a wonderful combination because then it says to you, your life in America is as a Christian as much as it is as an American now. That you are a follower of Jesus in the same way that you are Chinese American or Korean American. This is really wonderful. Now, it becomes a problem when those things, say our ethnic identity or our being America, takes precedent or priority over being Christian. Say the greed is an example of that. But it can also do really wonderful things. So you may know of, for example, the documentary A Village Called Versailles, which is about Vietnamese immigrants who end up in the American South, New Orleans. And they congregate around a church, a Catholic parish. I think it's called Mary, Queen of the World. And they come to America and they go to church to take the sacrament and to be received into that communion. But they also go there to learn how to navigate an American grocery store and learn how to speak English and develop friendships with one another, while the rest of the society is largely a black and white society. Um, the documentary follows the church from the Vietnam War forward in the 1980s, as they kind of bring all these people to America and introduce them to, what it means, for example, to take the Holy Eucharist as Americans, as Vietnamese people, and how to speak English and these kinds of things. But later on, when Hurricane Katrina hits in the 2000s and New Orleans is devastated, um, the city and state government decide to not rebuild that part of New Orleans, even though after those many decades, there was quite a large population of Vietnamese. They were actually going to literally use that as a dump for the new building of the New Orleans. So they're going to end this community. Well, it actually became through that church that Vietnamese and Black citizens fought back, and they fought their way all the way to the state and federal court system that then supported them and didn't allow the state and federal government to end their communities. That's a powerful story, and that kind of stuff happens, not as dramatically, but happens all the time. Local Asian communities, like the church I go, sometimes attend here, the Raleigh Chinese Christian Church, or the Atlanta Chinese Christian Church, or North Carolina Korean Presbyterian Church, or the one my wife grew up in, the Chinese Baptist Church of Orange County. These first generation that then stretch out to new generations of immigrants and their families are incredibly powerful forms of socialization to America, but equally socialization to America as Christians. Um, these churches have also fallen on rough times as kids grow up to be young adults and they have their own families. And there's been something in America documented by folks called the silent exodus, the exit of Christians out of churches. But this is not simply a phenomenon of Asian American churches, it's a phenomenon of the church in America. And so the struggles in the Asian American churches are really a subset of the struggles in church in general, which is largely the struggle of why should you remain Christian when there are all kinds of ways to be happy, not Christian. For example, why not follow the American dream? The one of greed and prosperity, especially if you have a degree from Princeton or Harvard or something like that. Um, I still want to say that, oh, and one of the things I've noticed is that then the resourcing of these churches, it has a cascading effect. As these people leave, then the only dream in these churches is to go and be wealthy and go get your Harvard degree. What that doesn't facilitate is a different imagination, but it also means that the resources to facilitate a new imagination, a new story, are also taken away. So for example, in a Taiwanese church, the dream is to go to MIT, send your kid to MIT, and to be an electrical engineer. The dream isn't to send your kid to seminary to become a pastor. to facilitate a new imagination, like maybe your podcast does, right? It does, that's not the dream. The dream is this other thing. And if every talented kid in the church is encouraged to that and discouraged from this other thing, then that will occur over generations. That the church will become a barren wasteland. It will be a brain drain of our most talented kids. They'll go startup companies in which will make hundreds of millions of dollars, but what they won't be doing is growing the Asian American church. And I think we need to change that. And I want to be part of changing that. I want to fire the imagination of the younger generations and say, hey, why not take your big engineering brain and engineer a different kind of small group experience, right? Take your great literary brain instead of becoming, this, teach people how to read scripture. Take your powerful social engineering brain and think both about community organizing, but organizing food kitchens and churches and organizing local forms of democratic direct action through the local church, the Black church in relationship to the Asian church, fighting together like they did in New Orleans. I think this is the cutting edge, what I'm hoping will call people back to. I think the American dream, the one about going to fancy schools and making money, is a cool dream, but it's a small dream. And I don't think people actually, it keeps people's interest for very long because greed may tell us wealth will keep us happy, but of course, no one actually believes it does. But it's also just a boring dream after a while. It's easy to make money in America. You just need greed and some ingenuity. It's much more exciting, interesting to change people's lives, to call people to something more radical than the American dream. The American dream is what you do when you're so bored you can't think of anything more. What Jesus gives us is far more exciting than that.
Well, I wish you the best of success. And on that note, thank you very much, Kat Tran of Duke University, for joining the show.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being on the show.
Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you.